Well, hi, my name is Logan. Welcome to the special edition DVD of the John Woo classic, A Better Tomorrow. Here we see the logo of Atlas International. It's a German film company who bought and distributed a lot of these classic Hong Kong titles back in the 80s, at a time when the films were not really as well known internationally as they are now. The movie A Better Tomorrow, shot in 1986 under the Cantonese title英雄本色, which is英雄is hero and 本色 is true colors, so true colors of a hero. And a moment ago you saw these brief references. We don't see the logos of the companies, but we see a reference to Cinema City, which was the production company, the overall production company making the film, which was a company formed by Raymond Wong, Carl Mac-Gar and Dean Sheck. And then Film Workshop, which is a company owned by the director and producer Choi Hark, whose name we see there. Film Workshop actually got its name from a course that he used to teach at Hong Kong University, and he just wanted a name for his company, so it became Film Workshop. And there's the Bank of China building, panning down to one of the great icons of 1980s action cinema, world action cinema, Chow Yun-fat as Mark Gore. Gore means brother, his brother Mark. And here he is buying some Cheung Fun, which is like a snack. It's kind of like a fried dough snack from a street vendor. The gag is these street vendors actually were operating illegally. If you didn't have a vendor's license, you're operating illegally on the streets of Hong Kong. So the vendor's being chased away by a police officer. But now, this style, the coat and the dark glasses and all these other things, slow motion, and later we see Chow Yun-fat with the double guns. We've seen it so many times since, it's become a cliche, but this is like the archetype from which the stereotype is derived. So we're seeing it for the first time, and it's hard now to imagine the impact that this character and that this film had on the Hong Kong audience when it was first released in 1986. And for this movie, the director John Woo brought together three very an unusual mix of leading players. As well as Chow Yun-fat, you have on the right of the frame coming in there Dick Lung, who had been a major action star at the Shaw Brothers studio, and he was a kung fu and swordplay star, and then was coming into this movie and being reinterpreted as somebody who is more of a character actor who could star in these contemporary gangster action thrillers. And later we see Leslie Cheung, who was a very popular singing star in Hong Kong at the time and also had done some film work, but really again coming into his own as a big screen performer. So John Woo really seeing in each of them attributes that other directors had not yet seen, and he's kind of redefining the characters of each actor in this film. And I think this is one of the things, when you look back on it now, what made this film gave it the impact it did is the actors themselves were already familiar to the Hong Kong audience, but they were being redefined in a new and exciting way, and that's really what made this such a different experience and such a hugely influential film of 1986. It's actually a remake of an earlier film shot in 1967, Story of a Discharged Prisoner, which was directed by Lung Gong, a.k.a. Patrick Lung. And those of you who are fans of Jet Li may have seen the film Black Mask, directed by Daniel Lee. This is one of the icons of great iconic images of 80s Hong Kong cinema. Money to Burn, as Chow Yun-fat's lighting his cigarette with a $100 bill. But as I was saying, Lung Gong directed Story of a Discharged Prisoner, and Lung Gong is actually the bad guy at the end of the movie Black Mask, starring Jet Li. But he was known primarily in Hong Kong circles as a director. Now look carefully here. You see this is the building where the bad guys are kind of conducting their counterfeiting operation. These are kind of bad guys in the sense that they're Hong Kong gangsters. They're members of a triad, an illegal organization, a triad organization. We see this very distinctive red underground car parking entrance 3 times in the movie. First time is when they're coming out in the limo. Second time is when Chow Yun-fat's characters kind of reach rock bottom. The third time is when he comes out and he's coming for his shot of redemption. And so just mention that in passing. There's kind of a fun play here because Chow Yun-fat's actually of Hakka descent. Hakka is like would be perceived as being a kind of country bumpkin, as an indigenous tribe of people who've moved to Hong Kong, and they're living on boats and dealing in seafood and are not particularly perceived as being well educated. They're like fighters, they're working men, they're dockers. And so here you have Dick Lung's character is much more the urbane businessman. He's speaking in English with the man they're doing business with. And in the background you can hear this kind of rather odd dubbing of the voices of Chow Yun-fat and the 2 white guys. It's obvious that Chow Yun-fat cannot speak English. He's just saying, of course, again and again. And that plays to the image that he'd had on TV and the image that he was one of the people of Hong Kong. And the people of Hong Kong, most of them don't speak English. So they could really empathize with this guy who's having to kind of fake it for these Westerners. She mentioned the sunglasses that we see Chow Yun-fat wearing through the early part of the film. They're actually the Alain Delon signature sunglasses. I guess the French actor Alain Delon was the first guy to have his own, one of the early actors to have his own brand of eyewear. And Alain Delon was such an icon for the Hong Kong filmmaking fraternity that they actually had a pair of his glasses in the movie, which is kind of a nod to the fact that this film very much follows on from the French tradition of the crime thrillers they've been doing in France, the films that Melville and Clouseau had been making, very influential on John Woo. Mr. Yu, now in this scene the head of the Triad Syndicate, played by Set Yin-ji, who's a veteran movie actor. So I mentioned it's really the European influence mixed together with films from Sam Peckinpah in America and Sam Fuller. These are the films that this new generation, Choi Hark and John Woo and Ringo Lam, were watching, and you can see all of that put through the blender of Hong Kong's unique urban metropolis, and this is the result that you get. But it was very much the influence of French cinema, and you can see it even more in the film The Killer, which was a remake of the Alain Delon star Le Samurai. John Woo himself had come full circle in that he'd actually started off working for the prolific director Zhang Jit at Shaw Brothers as assistant director to Zhang Jit, who was doing all these swordplay movies about brothers in arms, guys going into the field of battle, about the relationship between these warriors. And John Woo had left Zhang Jit's patronage and gone into other kind of films. He'd done opera movies, comedy movies, musicals, and never really found his métier. And finally, with A Better Tomorrow, he came around and said, well, why don't I reinterpret all of the ideas and concepts of Zhang Jit, all these ideas about the Heng Dai, the Bonder Brotherhood of Yi Hei, the idea of chivalry and nobility in the martial world, the Gong Wu, and I'll just transpose that into modern times, and even get an actor known for doing those films in the person of Dick Lung. But instead of swords, they're going to have guns. And instead of being in the Gong Wu of like the old martial arts era, they will be in the Gong Wu, they will be in the kind of the underworld, the Hak Sai Woi, the black societies of Hong Kong. And he did it marvelously well, and this film really not only redefined the actors he chose, but it redefined John Woo himself. Here is the Hong Kong Chinese University, or a part thereof, actually doubling for a hospital for this specific sequence. But it's interesting looking at John Woo's films, how, like Zhang Jit, who was his mentor, his films always focus on the bond between brothers. It's always about male relationships. For example, here, Dick Lung actually says he used his relationship with another younger Shaw Brothers actor, Alexander Fu Sing, as the basis for his relationship with Leslie Cheung, who plays his brother Kit. And Fu Sing had been another kung fu and swordplay star at Shaw Brothers. He died tragically young, but they'd had a kind of older, younger brother relationship, so Dick Lung used this as a reference when he was actually playing this role in this movie. You always find with John Woo that for the first run of his movies, like Zhang Jit, his focus is almost exclusively on the male relationships. And Emily Chu, who we see here, is really very much this kind of quirky, very broad female characterization. You almost have to wait until he went to America and John Woo did the movie Face Off before you see a kind of a fully realized female character in a John Woo movie. But here, really, the woman is played for laughs, as a pain in the ass, and this was very much in the tradition of what Zhang Jit would do in his films. It was always about the relationship between the brothers, and women were kind of dangerous or a nuisance, and this was like obviously something that really had imposed itself very strongly on John Woo. And so when he started doing his version of the heroic swordplay movies, that's what he did as well. He focused on the guys and pushed women to the side. Now, the father here is Tian Feng, who has also been a prolific Shaw Brothers actor in films like Trail of the Broken Blade, The Assassin with Wong Yu, Shadow Whip with Cheng Pei Pei, and he'd also worked with the great director King Hu on Fate of Li Khan and Raining in the Mountain. He's probably best known internationally as he played Bruce Lee's senior student in the movie Fist of Fury. But he had, like many of these guys, an extraordinarily long and prolific career. He was Jackie Chan's father in the film Dragon Lord. He had another character role as a patriarch in Jackie's film Miracles. Even up to last year, he was working on Wong Kar-wai's short film The Hand. And we see him, the father, again later, but this is another great character actor in a supporting role. Choi Hark at the right of the judges, and the other guy is actually Patrick Leung, who was like the assistant, who was the assistant director on this movie, Patrick Leung Pak Yin. often Choi himself, as well as producing this movie, has this cameo. He's the guy with the glasses and the little goatee, and who's on the bottom side there of that pile-up. And he had worked on several films like Working Class, Yes, Madam, in quite major roles as an actor. He's got a unique look and a kind of very kind of quirky screen presence. And so you see him cameoing in many of his movies. In his recent Seven Swords, he was like a tribesman in like a remote outpost. And as I mentioned, the other guy who's there in the judging is Patrick Le, Lem Bak Yin, who's assistant director to John Woo for most of the major John Woo films. Later became a director in his own right. He shot the boxing films Somebody Up There Likes Me and Born Wild, and also the horror movie Demi Haunted. And interestingly, there are three Patricks involved in this movie. There was Lung Gong, the director of the original film Story of a Discharged Prisoner, is actually Patrick Lung Gong. There was Tse Yi, and the star of that movie is Patrick Tse, and there's Patrick Leung, who's the assistant director. So that's a good trivia question for whenever we do the Hong Kong Trivial Pursuit board game. The Choi, again, getting his car damaged. And again, I mentioned this is Emily Chu. This character really played for laughs, and a typical use of a female character in this stage of John Woo's career. And look at Chow Yun-fat. He finally found a chance to wear that sweater Auntie Beryl gave him last Christmas. And this is actually very much like the kind of bars and clubs that people of all backgrounds would hang out in the 80s. The story coming up in which Chow Yun-fat's talking really about Yihei, which is chivalry, and about the bond of brothers between Heng Dai. Heng Dai basically means older, younger brothers, but if you're like talking about somebody who's being your Heng Dai, it's really a bond that's as close or closer than your actual family. So he's trying to illustrate for their young student, played by YZ Lee, what is the real nature, like what is the英雄本色, what are the true colors of a hero. So he's telling this story about a time when, to save the life of Chow Yun-fat's character Mark Gore, that Ken had to drink urine in a club because they'd offended one of the big gangsters, and he actually, to give face, had to do it. This story actually happened, but it happened to Chow Yun-fat and the director Ringo Lam Ling-dong. And so when they were preparing the scene, John Woo said, is there a story that you know? Is there anything you can tell that really tells about Yihei, about honor and, kind of sacrifice for a friend? And Chow Yun-fat told him the story, so they used it in this scene. And it's actually acted out in a later John Woo film, Bullet in the Head. So obviously it made quite an impact. I don't know how Ringo felt about them borrowing his story, but anyway. The song playing in the background is Gehoi Feng Yu, or Jisu Feng Yu, How Much Wind and Rain We've Gone Through, or like a kind of a turbulent life of wind and rain. And it's sung by Roman Tam, who is another cantopop singer, a contemporary of Chow Yun-fat and of Leslie Cheung, who also tragically died last year. It was a terrible year for our industry. 2 years ago, I'm sorry. We lost Leslie Cheung, we lost Roman Tam, and also the actress Anita Moy. So it was a black year for our business, and that was his song playing in the background of this scene to kind of counterpoint the story that's being told. So as I mentioned, Chow Yun-fat had come through the TVB Actors Training Program. TVB was like the major station that came on to kind of replace Shaw Brothers as the major purveyor of entertainment. And Shaw Brothers kind of evolved from being a major film studio into being a major television station. And Chow was a major star there, particularly in the series Shanghai Bund. He'd done previously some films of merit, Story of Wu Viet for An Hui, Hong Kong 1941 for Pu Chi Leong, but these films hadn't really done well at the box office. At the time this movie was made, he was regarded as box office poison, and the distributors, the Asian distributors, Hong Kong distributors, are hugely influential in the business, were kind of down on their knees to Choi Hark and to John Woo, saying, please use anybody else instead of Chow Yun-fat, because Chow Yun-fat will kill us at the box office. Luckily for Chow Yun-fat and the rest of us, they didn't listen. This little bit here shows you actually that Hong Kong can look kind of tropical. It's kind of a Hawaii look with the palm trees blowing in the breeze, and we're introducing the fact that the character played by Leslie Cheung is just graduate. And this little play here on the martial arts background of Dick Long. He's actually an expert of Wing Chun Kung Fu, but had been in like dozens of action pictures at Shaw Brothers, though he doesn't do any martial arts in this particular film. So you get a little nod there, and the relationship between the two of them. And seeing Leslie here so young and bright, it makes it all the more tragic that we lost him as early as we did. It's it was like as I mentioned before, a real bad year for 2 years ago was a terrible year for the industry. Leslie committed suicide. Roman Tam, who was singing the song in the last scene, died of cancer, as did Anita Moy. Anita Moy was a wonderful actress and singer. She'd starred with Chow Yun-fat in several movies, particularly Greatest Lover, which was a comedy film which he starred in after this movie, which was a massive hit. It was actually as big a hit in Hong Kong as A Better Tomorrow, but the comedies and romantic films he made didn't tend to travel as well. Here we have Taipei. We're in Taiwan. And many filmmakers from Hong Kong had shot on location there. John Woo had been there filming Marco Polo with Zheng Jit, and Jackie Chan shot many of his earlier starring films. Again, here we have the archetype that became a stereotype, the guy in the white suit. Here it's Dick Lung going into kind of an impractical thing to wear if you're a gangster going to a business meeting, but he has like the white suit going on. And Chow Yun-fat himself would wear the white suit in John Woo's later film, The Killer. So this sequence here we're seeing is actually in Hong Kong, doubling for Taipei. Because the action sequences, you really needed the stunt team and the squibs for the action that we're going to see. You needed a Hong Kong crew for that. It was decided to shoot in the new territories. So here we have Chan Chi-fai coming out as the treacherous gangster. Chan Chi-fai actually is a Hong Kong actor, but he's speaking Mandarin in the scene and pretending to be, and then he's playing a Taiwanese gangster character. You could also see Chan Chi-fai in the movie City on Fire, which was the movie that Chow Yun-fat starred in that really put Ringo Lam on the map, and he's also in the later gangster films Young and Dangerous 4 and 5. But he's a familiar face for anybody who sees Hong Kong gangster or action films. So this interior and the exterior that we saw are all shot in Hong Kong. And you notice you never actually see the police cars and the policemen in the same shot as that location. The reason is because the policemen in the distinctive Taiwanese uniforms and those cars, everything is actually shot in Taipei or near Taipei and in Taiwan, and these sequences actually shot in Hong Kong. But Taiwan at the time did not have a very strong indigenous film industry, and it was the studios were primarily booked out by Hong Kong filmmakers. There wasn't that much space to shoot in Hong Kong, and increasingly with people building in the new territories, there was less and less open land. So Taiwan provided a really good location and a very good alternative to shooting in Hong Kong. So people like John Woo had filmed there and were familiar, could speak Mandarin, were familiar with the Taiwanese film culture, so they could actually, it made sense to set some of the scenes for this film in Taipei. But all of this, what we're really seeing at the first action sequence of the movie is all shot in Hong Kong. And this shot's where you see the other guys, the policemen running. Now we're in Taipei. This is very distinctive, these fields. You see this in the movie Black Gold, also known as Island of Greed. You see those very distinctive strips of field, and that's kind of farming that's done specifically in Taipei. This guy's David Lam, former bodybuilding champion, and he speaks Mandarin in this movie, plays a character who speaks Mandarin. You can also see him as a big heavy at the end of the Jackie Chan film, The Protector. Here we are in Causeway Bay, and we very rarely see phone boxes now in Hong Kong. Everybody's got cell phones, so phone boxes are less common. This is actually a set, and this is very similar to what you would see for a Hong Kong TV series. It's very hard to get cameras and crews into tiny Hong Kong apartments, so you would have to kind of have walls that you could pull away. Here you basically have a set, so one of the walls is pulled away, so you can move the cameras and crews around. It actually works as a relatively convincing apartment set, but it's a bit bigger than you would normally find in Hong Kong, and this is very similar to what you would see in a Hong Kong television series. So Emily Chiu, who we're seeing here, Chu Bo-yi, was actually born in Los Angeles, and she made her debut starring with Chow Yun-fat in a movie called Witch from Nepal, which was directed by the action director Ching Su-dong. And surprisingly, it was a flop. It was a pretty poor start to the directing career of Ching Su-dong. Later, of course, he would redeem himself with A Chinese Ghost Story, which Leslie Cheung Kok-wing starred in. You can also see Emily Chiu opposite Jackie Chan in the movie Heart of the Dragon, a.k.a. First Mission. And she was also with Sammo Hung's movie Millionaire's Express. And also working again with Leslie Cheung in the movie Rouge, produced by Jackie Chan and directed by Stanley Kwan, which is a beautiful romantic ghost drama with Anita Moy. Now, this sequence is interesting to me, looking at how the different films that John Woo had made prior to this are kind of reflected in his breakthrough film, A Better Tomorrow. Because one thing he had done, which people forget, now he'd actually been launched at Golden Harvest as John Woo, the new king of comedy. And I see a few scenes in this movie which have a very darkly comedic aspect to them. And this is one of them, because if you actually look at this fight sequence here in this apartment, the different kind of tricky bits, obviously it's played relatively straight and it ends in tragedy, but you could actually score it to different music and edit it slightly differently, and you'd have quite a comedic sequence of a family taking on this great big Daijetlo, this great big monster of a man, and using everything in their apartment to kind of like to try to beat him up, and it could actually be quite a comedic scene. And I think it's just the way it's spun out here is towards being played slightly more seriously, and of course the poor father dies at the end. But this, I think, is very much, if you go back and look at movies like Plain Jane to the Rescue and To Hell with the Devil, the films that John Woo had made at Golden Harvest, you actually get to see this very broad physical comedy being expressed. And this scene to me is the scene here which really references that, and you look at this and go, okay, this is the kind of scene that if you said to the new king of comedy, do an action movie, this is the kind of scene you'd come up with. And it's kind of very, also it reflects, I think, a little bit the influence of Choi Hart, because Choi Hart was somebody, even in the most serious scenes in his own movies, has a kind of a playful aspect, a playful attribute. I think, contrary to what some people have said, Choi Hart was relatively hands-off in terms of the physical production of the films made at Cinema City, but where he did become involved is in the editing and music and the marketing of the films that were made. But this kind of thing here with the pan and the face, and it's really just 2 beats away from slapstick, and if you actually put some funny music over it, I think it would play pretty much along those levels. I should mention the cinematography here. It's really very well executed, because to do any sequence supposedly in the dark and have light sources that make sense so the audience can very clearly see what's happening is actually quite a challenge, because obviously if someone turns off the lights, supposedly no one can see anything within the scene, so if it's too obvious that the scene is lit, the audience are going to go, well, why can't they see where everybody else is? And I think that the lighting of this particular sequence is very well executed. So hats off to the DP, Horace Wong-Wing-Hang, who does a fantastic job throughout the film. And again, working with John Woo really defined a new style of action thriller of Hong Kong cinema. And you just cannot overspeak the influence this film had, both on filmmaking, not all kinds of filmmaking, but specifically in creating this new kind of action thriller. Now, these tunnels that we're seeing here, this sequence actually is in Hong Kong, and these are the old anti-aircraft tunnels that were built to protect the Hong Kong troops from the Japanese bombing during World War II. And there was no equivalent structure in Taiwan, so they actually shot this sequence between Dick Leung and Wai Zi in Hong Kong, and then where all the scenes where you see the police officers in the background are actually shot in Taiwan and cut together in such a way that you don't really notice. But if you know Hong Kong geography and you know where these old tunnels are, they're actually used in a number of other films shot in Hong Kong around about this period. I don't know if they're still there. They may have been built on, because in Hong Kong the landscape changes so quickly with construction. So this whole sequence, the Taiwan sequence, very cleverly executed, so you actually get some sequences where it was necessary to shoot in Taipei, they're shooting in Taiwan, and where they didn't need to, or it was more effective to shoot in Hong Kong, shooting in Hong Kong. So here, Dick Leung actually fires his gun in Hong Kong, and it's heard in Taiwan. So that's kind of a cool, the wonders of film. The music of the film is quite an interesting challenge, and one of the most memorable scores of Hong Kong cinema, and composed by the great, I would say, like the grand old man of the music of Hong Kong cinema, who actually, it's extraordinary the length of career that people have had working in films, because Joseph Koo, who did the music for this movie, also scored the Bruce Lee films, and would then go on, up till today, is still doing music for films, is still doing live shows. The lyricist James Wong, who worked with him on one of the songs for this movie, sadly passed away, but a fantastic job done, and one of the most major music cues coming up at the end of this sequence, which is in the center of Taipei in Taiwan. And look at this, the iconic image of Mark Gore of Chow Yun-fat. It's just a great image, and the shot coming up, I mean, it just, kids all over Hong Kong were getting sunglasses and long coats and smoking and having a matchstick. This is such a great image. This is just so cool, and it works so well. And there's this music score that you hear. Now, you always get with these films a mixture of music that's actually specially composed, and some that's taken from different sources. Actually, one of the music cues here is taken from the Alan Parker film Birdie. Now, the Taiwanese gang boss who we see here, Wang Hap, Wang Jie, is actually a Taiwanese actor who worked at Shaw Brothers. This sequence, actually, the office is in Hong Kong, but he's a Taiwanese actor, so they're putting him in speaking Mandarin with a Taiwanese accent to fit with the fact that it's meant to be Taiwan. If you go back and look at the old Shaw Brothers movies, you can see Wang Hap in films like Super Inframan, Empress Dowager. He's with Dick Lung in the movie Killer Clans, and actually made his last film with Dick Lung, which was called A Killer's Blues. And Wang Hap's son, Dave Wong, is actually a singer and actor in Hong Kong, and you can see him opposite Jackie Chan in New Police Story. So that's like a dynasty of filmmakers in Hong Kong. This is a brief cameo appearance here from Wang Hap. This sequence, the most, again, of all the influential scenes, probably the most influential sequence. This interior, again, meant to be in Taipei. The exterior is in Taipei, the interior is a studio set in Hong Kong. And the song playing in the background is actually an old Taiwanese dialect, Hokkien song song called Mian Shi Qi, Do Not Lose Your Will, and it's sung by an 80s singer called Chen Xiaoyun, and the song is Mian Shi Qi. So they have this song playing, and it's a wonderful counterpoint to this whole sequence. I remember Quentin Tarantino being interviewed, and he said there's this, you see before the shootout that Chow Yun-fat's hiding these guns in the flower pots because he might need them later. He says you could watch 100 Hong Kong movies and you would 100 American movies, you would never see anything as clever as that. And here we go, this wonderful use of taking the San Peckinpah one step further, slow motion, finally finding a way to make swordplay, to make gunplay as exciting as swordplay. As John Woo's kind of said, okay, we're not going to do swords anymore, we're going to have a new kind of hero, but we'll make the gunplay look as exciting as martial arts did. So you get this extraordinary blast of action. Again, so many guys you've seen in Reservoir Dogs and other films, people blasting away with two guns at the same time. But this is the scene that really established that as the new aesthetic for on-screen gunplay, and was imitated and arguably never bettered. But for people who'd seen earlier Hong Kong films where the gunplay was so boring compared to the martial arts fighting, basically you'd fire a gun and somebody fell down, this was an extraordinary revelation. And the music cue here, I love this one. Earlier as he was standing at the railway crossing, and the music cue here is just wonderful. Actually, it's called Birdie's Flight, and it's from the soundtrack of the Nicolas Cage film Birdie, the film Nicolas Cage starred in for Alan Parker, called Birdie. And it's performed by Peter Gabriel. And this was kind of the nature of music in Hong Kong in this era. They would take music from other films and compose film music specially. But this use of slow motion here, it was something that had come in from Hong Kong filmmakers watching movies like Bonnie and Clyde, watching the Sam Peckinpah films, seeing how American cinema had this raw, visceral quality after the abolition of the Hayes Office, when you could actually show violence, you could show action in slow motion, you could show the shooter and the shot in the same frame, and you could really there's a visceral nature to the cinema that was different to what people had seen before. It's played off here now. Here we have John Woo in his supporting role, kind of say cameo, because he appears several times in the movie as this indefatigable police chief, and just really establishing the character there. And we pick up on that later when he's still hot on pursuit of the character play. He's this kind of indefatigable lawman on the trail of Dick Lung's character. Here's the prison sequences, supposedly in Taiwan. Actually, these prison sequences shot in Hong Kong, and pretty good cooperation between the police services and the prison services and filmmakers during the 80s. On the streets, it was tricky, but if you actually paid money to the Hong Kong government, you could get access to the training grounds, and you could get access to the prison to shoot, and this is what they did for this movie. So these scenes here, where you're seeing police training and seeing prison sequences, is actually shot at correctional facilities and at police training academy, and you pay some money to the government. But when you actually try to shoot on the streets in Hong Kong, it's very hard for Hong Kong filmmakers to get permission. It was a lot easier for foreign filmmakers shooting in Hong Kong to get permission. There's a real old New Territories police station, and it's since been decommissioned. You actually see that also as the Marine Police headquarters in Jackie Chan's film Project A. This also very much plays to the idea of John Woo, the new king of comedy, because I thought this is a comedic moment, would not have been out of place in a Jackie Chan film. And in fact, it almost is in a Jackie Chan film. If you look at Project A, when he's riding along and knocks on the door and the guy opens it and knocks off the guy that's chasing him, it's kind of the same riff, it's the same gag. But Leslie Cheung is interesting to me. He's a guy who, in person, had a very gentle persona, but was completely believable as a very tough macho cop, which is something that not everybody with his particular persona, not everybody who's like as gentle as Leslie Cheung is can play that kind of role so effectively. And there's John Woo. And of course, the interesting thing is John Woo now playing the detective role, the guy that... This is where the original film kind of begins, Story of a Discharged Prisoner, with the character played by Tse Yin, Patrick Tse, has been in prison, comes out, tries to reintegrate with society, and finds that there's a stigma attached to being a former prisoner, and so it's very hard for him to find work and have a normal life. And he's pursued in Story of a Discharged Prisoner by this very hard-edged cop, played by the director, played by Patrick Lung-gong. And in this movie, the same character, equivalent character, is played by the director, by John Woo, by Mu Sum. And it's kind of a really casting against type, because I don't know anybody in the industry who's nicer, kinder, more patient than John Woo. And here he is playing this very tough... I mean, he's a good guy. I mean, he's on the side of law and order, but he's definitely not a sympathetic character for the audience. He's like the inspector on the trail of the former inmate in Les Miserables. So here we are at the Warhapset Cemetery in Kowloon, the permanent cemetery. It used to be that you'd have temporary cemeteries where Chinese people were interred until their remains could be sent to their hometown. This looks like kind of fake rain from a rain machine. It is fake rain from a rain machine, but you know what's funny? In Hong Kong, you actually do get rain that looks like this and starts off as quickly as the rain did just there. This actually is a rain machine, but it was something that, again, this is what Shakespeare calls sympathetic nature, the idea that nature reflects the turbulent relationship between people. And this is something that was inherited from Shakespeare, who in turn had influenced Kurosawa, who in turn had influenced Cheung Jit, and there you see this kind of the river of influence in terms of action cinema going down through the generations till you come now to John Woo. And of course there are other directors like the Pang brothers, who borrowed extensively for Bangkok Dangerous. They borrowed extensively from the restaurant gunfight sequence that we saw earlier in the film. So it's great to see each new generation being influenced by and building on that which has been done before. So this, again, the idea of having a confrontation in the rain, very... you see all the way through the Shaw Brothers movies, the Cheung Jit movies. This is very much like a Cheung Jit scene. The difference being, if you had a Cheung Jit movie, a Chang Che movie, you would have a stylization to the action sequence between the fighting the brothers who are clashing. Here it's very raw. I mean, the martial arts or the fist fighting in this film is they've made a conscious decision to keep it very raw and unstylized, as a kind of a counterpoint to the gunplay, which is specifically stylized and created a whole new aesthetic of on-screen gunplay. And it's interesting seeing Dick Lung playing like a guy who's gone down the wrong track. As a youngster, obviously made a decision to go down the wrong track in life, because if you look at his earlier films at Shaw Brothers, even though he's famous for the swordplay films, he did play these kind of rebel without a cause characters. He was in a movie called Dead End, one of his earlier films that he was in, directed by Cheung Jit. Cheung Jit did do contemporary gangster youth action films, as well as the swordplay movies for which he's more renowned. And actually, Dick Lung directed himself in a movie called Young Lovers on Flying Wheels. Here's Kenneth Chiang, Chang Gong. Extraordinary career. This guy actually has a degree in architecture, and he studied in the US and then came back to work in Hong Kong cinema. He was in the latter black and white Wong Fei-hung kung fu movies starring Quan Tai-hing. He actually played the character of Leung Fun, who is like the right-hand man of Wong Fei-hung in the old black and white movies, and had also been in a lot of dramas. Great range as an actor, very intelligent, very urbane individual. And this film really kind of, again, redefined him as a character player. In this movie, you see him as he's kind of a very saintly figure, the guy that's actually trying to help these kind of ex-prisoners to get reintegrated into society. In the original film, the story of the discharged prisoner is actually a woman played by Ga Ling. Is this character, the function of this character is actually a woman. So true to form with the approach, the Cheung Jit approach to filmmaking, in this film it's a guy played by the great Kenneth Chiang. So after working on this film, his character returns in A Better Tomorrow 2. We're going to see Chang Gong in major roles in like The Killer, Once a Thief, which are both later John Woo pictures. And then when Chow Yun-fat went to Hollywood, he kind of took Kenneth Chiang with him, because Kenneth Chiang is also in the Hollywood Chow Yun-fat movies, The Replacement Killers and Anna and the King. And he's really been the go-to guy for these patrician, stern Asian figures seen in American movies. You can see him opposite Pierce Brosnan in the James Bond film Die Another Day, and he recently was the general in the American movie Memoirs of a Geisha. I actually worked opposite him in a movie called Six Strong Guys, and he is actually a very imposing presence in real life as well as on film. So this is like the big reveal of how the mighty have fallen, of how Chow Yun-fat's character has fallen, has been reduced to this after sustaining the injury when he goes to take vengeance for the betrayal of Dick Lung's character. And it's like a really great juxtaposition between then and now. And wonderful acting. I mean, Hong Kong actors are great reactors, I think. The guy on the right coming out there is Xing Fu-on, the bodyguard. Daisaw is his nickname, Daisaw, which means big stupid. And then we see Wei Li, his character Xing, has risen to become the leader. He's wearing the white coat. I guess wearing the white is the symbol of power for this sequence. And I like the contemptuous way he throws the money down there. It's just like the old Cocteau state, never state where you can imply. So you get, in this brief scene, you get the situation now, the difference in the situation between Wei Li's character and that of Chow Yun-fat, and also Dick Lung just reacting to it. Now here again we see that distinctive red gateway down to the car park, and we see it at this point when Chow Yun-fat's character has hit like the lowest level, and has been only enduring this because he's waiting for Dick Lung to come back from prison so they can reclaim their position as leaders of the triad. So the job of reinterpreting the original film as A Better Tomorrow went to a Chan Hing-gai, who's a very gifted Hong Kong-based scriptwriter. I mean, often you see with these films that the director will also get a credit, but the director's kind of supervising the scriptwriting process and would be advising on what elements of the film to transfer from the original story of Discharged Prisoners to A Better Tomorrow. But Chan Hing-gai actually had written the first major movie for Leslie Cheung when Leslie Cheung was establishing himself as a Shaw Brothers actor. He wrote the movie Behind the Yellow Line at Shaw Brothers. Also wrote First Option and Beast Cops for Gordon Chan, and I worked with him. He wrote Twins Effect, a movie I was a producer on, and he also directed a film I acted in called Naked Ambition. So very talented individual, Chan Hing-gai, and somebody who's still very much on the scene. And when I do commentary, I always hate to do the horse racing thing of like telling you what's happening. But I have to say, when I look at this sequence, I'm really impressed by, I feel sad in a way, how we've lost ground. I mean, that we don't seem to have actors who have this weight and this commitment that we see here from these two wonderful players. And I mean, you know why? It's because now people are discovered at the age of 17 and thrown in the deep end to be pop stars who are playing leading roles in movies. Here you had Dick Lung, who'd come through dozens and dozens of movies of all genre, shot at Shaw Brothers, and came out with this extraordinary weight of ability, experience, and as a real person, as somebody in real life. Chow Yun-fat, the same, had come in later, not really established himself as a movie actor, but had done hours and hours of television work for TVB, had done a certain number of films. And so by the time you see them here, they've got that experience and life experience to draw on. So there's a certain there's a verisimilitude here that I think is lacking from some of the films we see today. Even films where they're trying to do similar gangster epics. There's discussion at the moment about doing a remake of A Better Tomorrow. And apparently there was some Stephen Fung Dutlan, who directed House of Fury. And before that did kind of riffed on the image of Hong Kong gangsters with his first movie, Enter the Phoenix. And it's hard to think who you would cast in the film. And apparently what he's doing is there was some confusion about the rights to this version of A Better Tomorrow. He's going back to remake the original 英雄本色, which is a story of a discharged prisoner, which doesn't have the character of Mark Gore, Chow Yun-fat's character, which is the great iconic character. But it's still a very strong story, so it'd be interesting to see how it's reinterpreted. The challenge you have now is finding actors who can rise to the challenge of roles with the complexities that we're seeing here. Leslie Cheung, Cheung Kwok-wing, had come in the latter era of Shaw Brothers and never really established himself as a Shaw Brothers actor. He made his debut in Erotic Dreams of Red Chamber. He was in the movie Behind the Yellow Line. He really only came into his own when he shifted away from Shaw's and was working with Cinema City, working for Choi Hark. Choi Hark produced this movie, which gave him a very strong role opposite two really established veterans with Chow Yun-fat and Dick Lung. He also was the star of a Chinese ghost story, which Choi Hark had produced, was directed by Ching Soo-dong, and would work again with Emily Chu, who's his co-star in this movie, in the film Rouge for Stanley Kwan. And then in later years really came into his own as one of the mainstays of the industry, both as a singing star and as an actor, with movies like Viva Erotica and Temptress Moon. And just somebody who passed away far too soon, but in the process had left behind an extraordinary body of work, both as a genuine singing idol and as an actor. He also plays a cop role with the same kind of the character with the same kind of drive that he shows here in Daniel Lee's film Moonlight Express, and his last film was Inner Senses, and tragically committed suicide in 2003. So here we are. Now, one thing I mentioned about filmmaking, I mean, for those people who, quite rightly, just watching films and are not overly aware of the way in which they are made, this is actually the same location that we saw earlier in the film, where Chow Yun-fat was telling the story about how Dick Lung kind of saved him from being shot. And it'll be shot round about, maybe even on the same day. These scenes will be shot round about the same time. So the actors really have to have a fix on the characters and do the scene earlier in the film when, before Dick Lung has gone to prison, before Chow Yun-fat has been crippled, and then really a short amount of time later to come back in and play the scene that's set like 2 or 3 years down the track. So I think it's something to think about when we're looking at a movie for the third or fourth time, to kind of analyze the challenge of making this kind of film. And I think when you do that, you really appreciate even more the professionalism and the talent of these performers. The storytelling in the film, I think it's what sets it apart from other films of the genre is that the story doesn't stop for an action sequence. It doesn't stop for a dialogue or a comedic sequence. All the different aspects of the film are towards telling the story. So John Woo has obviously looked at all the elements you need to make a commercial film. He said when he went in to get financing and talked to Matt Garr. Matt Garr was one of the bosses of Cinema City. He also starred in a series of films called Aces Go Places, Jokai Pat Dong, with him and Sam Hui. He's famous with a shaved head and a goatee. Matt Garr basically said, who's going to be in the movie? And he said, well, it's going to be Dick Lung and Leslie Cheung, and a bit of a hard sell on Chow Yun-fat. And Matt Garr said, how many minutes of action? And John Woo said, well, about 40 minutes of the running time, a bit less of the action. Matt Garr says, oh, sounds good. Go and make it. That's how easy it was in those days. And then after that, it's working out all the commercial elements you need and how to make them serve the story. But sometimes you do see Hong Kong movies from the prolific 80s where it seems the elements have been inserted like at odds with the drive, the narrative drive of the story. But Chow Yun-fat at the time, I mean, it's hard to imagine now the idea that having Chow Yun-fat in a film would be perceived as a negative, but he was like so little thought of as a movie actor. If you go back to the original Hong Kong print of the movie, his actually English name is misspelled in the opening credits, and it's not Chow Yun, Y-U-N, as normal, as U-E-N. So he was actually had his name, the ultimate insult, his name was misspelled in the opening credits. This, of course, after this film came out, he was in incredible demand to reprise this, to do similar roles in movies like Rich and Famous, in 2 sequels to A Better Tomorrow, to work again with John Woo in The Killer and Hard Boiled. And even when he came into the American market to make films like The Replacement Killers and The Corruptor, which very much played on his image as the man of 1,000 bullets, as this kind of hard-as-nails gunplay hero. Chow Yun-fat himself is very much a homebody, very much a quiet individual. And he much prefers movies like Mabel Jones' film Autumn's Tale, in which he starred with Cherry Chung, and The Greatest Lover with him and Anita Moy. These are the films that are more to his taste. There's also the fact that he hates gunfire. He's scared of guns going off. So for him to make a love story would be a much more happy time than him being on the set of a movie like this, where there's stunt. And he's not the most physical of people, though he certainly, gives 110%. But he was like constantly challenging himself in these films, and for him to do a romantic comedy is much more near to the real Chow Yun-fat. And the character here is really a creation. This is like destroying his kind of smashing the mirror, which is like a kind of always an image. Somebody who's having challenge of identity, the best way to show it is have them smash the mirror, I suppose. And I like the fact that there's this realism to it. It actually cuts his hand, because it used to be in Hong Kong movies, no matter what people smashed their fist through, they themselves were never injured. So there's an element of reality there. Emily Chu Bo-yi, never really somebody with enormous range as an actress, but now married and retired from the industry. But I think she does as good a job here as the part demands. But as I mentioned earlier, it's really not a film where the female role is really given much focus and much attention. She's more an instrument to try to bring the brothers together than a fully formed character in her own right. Her last film was actually a period epic called The Magic Sword, and after that she got married and she retired from the industry. And that's normally the flight path of actresses in Hong Kong, that they work for a certain amount of time and then hopefully can marry some wealthy businessman and then they retire. And that's what happened with Lam Ching Ha, happened with Cherry Chung. Most of the major leading ladies of this era had a brief time in the sun, a relatively brief time in the sun, and then moved on to marriage and motherhood. And that was Chu Bo-yi's fate as well. And, of course, in the case of Dick Lung, you have somebody who'd been a leading man who then progressed and matured from there into doing character roles. It's a shame, in a way, he was under such an exclusive contract to Shaw Brothers, because apart from the Hammer Films Shaw Brothers crossover movie, Shatter, also known as they call him Mr. Shatter, that was his one foray into English language filmmaking. Otherwise, he was exclusively doing Mandarin language, Cantonese language action films for the studio. Here are the guys showing up. Now, this is one thing that always, to me, dates films, is the size of phones. Because in a moment, one of the guys gives the phone to Dick Lung, and it's like one of those big, clunky bricks, these cell phones, the early cell phones, or the early mobile phones that we used to have in the 1980s. And actually, in Hong Kong at that time, that kind of phone was known as the Daigor Dai, because the only guy, Daigor being Big Brother, so it was Big Brother Big, Big Brother's big phone, because the only guys initially who could afford them were gangsters, so you kind of see who was a gangster by who was carrying one of those clunky phones with them. So this was the early, I used to have one of those. I was not a gangster, but I had one of those phones in England, and it was always, even today in the Chinese community, those kind of phones were called Daigor Dai. And then we went to doing the cell phones, it became, South Dinhua, which is like kind of a hand phone, a phone you can carry. But to this day, those big clunky ones are Daigor Dai. And it's like, I always think, everything else in these films, sometimes the clothing styles go around in a circle and the action still looks fresh to this day. But the one thing that sets the movie as being back in the 80s is when you see the size of the cell phones. Lei Ji-hong, Wai-zi Lee, actually making his debut in this film, and a pretty accomplished debut it is as well, because he had not worked in film prior to this, and later would work for Kirk Wong on the movie Gunmen, then work again for the Cinema City team on The Big Heat, another crime gangster movie. Also, perhaps people are less aware of the fact that he had a parallel career working in these kind of fantastique films being made by the studio at the time, and he has a good role in A Chinese Ghost Story 2. Probably his most flashy part in a John Woo movie is in the later Bullet in the Head, where he was cast opposite Jackie Cheung and Tony Leung Chiu-wai. And I feel he probably was slightly miscast there and was a bit over the top in that particular role. But that was the flashiest role that he got in a John Woo film. In more recent years, he's been active on television. He was in a very popular TV series about firemen on TVB. And you can also see him in a comedic turn opposite Michelle Yeoh in the movie Wing Chun. So an actor of some range, and again, somebody who's worked consistently in so many films and television series that now, at the stage of their career that they have extraordinary experience behind them. And you could see him, the guy who's probably taken on the mantle of the crime thrillers that used to be made by Ringo Lam and John Woo and Kurt Wong is Johnny To Kei-fong. And you can actually see Wei-zi Lee, Lei Ji-hong in Running Out of Time, one of the latter very popular and award-winning thrillers from Johnny To, Running Out of Time, an Andy Lau vehicle. In the original movie, The Story of a Discharged Prisoner, this character, the bad guy, was played by Sek Keen, who was the bad guy in Enter the Dragon with Bruce Lee, and prior to that had been the bad guy in most of the old black and white Wong Fei-hung films. But unlike Kwan Tat-hing, the star of the Wong Fei-hung films, Sek Keen could appear in almost any film. He seemed to be in every movie shot during the late 50s and the 60s in Hong Kong. You see him on late night television in melodramas, gangster movies, kung fu movies, fantastique films. So he was like the one-eyed bad guy who, after the release of Tsai Yin's character from prison, tries to lure him back from the noble path, back into the Haksai Wui. Haksai Wui, the black society, back into the triad. So that function here being served by the character played by Wei-zi Lee, Lei Ji-hong. And that's as cool a shot of him as you're ever going to see in his career. That's as good as it's going to get for Wei-zi Lee. Good costume nod. The leather jacket worn by Dick Lung is actually a nod to the leather jacket worn throughout Discharged Prisoner by Patrick Tsai Yin. I don't know if I mentioned before, Tsai Yin actually is the father of Nicholas Tsai, Jie Fong, who starred in Time and Tide, which was directed by Choi Hark, and recently was in The Promise, and will next be seen in Dragon Tiger Gate. And again, another great dynasty of filmmakers. I guess if I'd been around at the time, I would have probably played this role, because they always haul in Westerners pretty much with no regard for acting background or experience to be in these movies. So whenever you see a white guy in a film of this era, it's normally some backpacker who's been hauled in from Chungking Mansions and is getting a few $100s to play a role. There's John Woo, our director, as I say, cast against type as a hard-as-nails cop. Sequence here in Chim Sa Choi, which is the touristy area, and always looks great on film at night because of you get that long stretch of Nathan Road with the neon lights. And in the back of the car, Wei-zi Lee and Xing Fuan, Dai Saw. Xing Fuan, also in The Killer for John Woo, he's got a very distinctive face. I mean, he has that very tough look about him. And his nickname, Big Stupid, I mean, he actually doesn't mind. He refers to himself as Big Stupid. And in films, his character is often called Dai Saw. His character name is Dai Saw, Big Stupid. So obviously he has a sense of humour about himself. This sequence reminded me very much of French Connection, the idea of the police officer who's doggedly following these guys who are expecting a specific shipment of drugs and, finding, in the discarded waste what appears to be the dock where this is actually going to happen. There's actually this concept of, was also, you see this in A Year of the Dragon, the Michael Cimino movie, the idea of it being a key plot point. What is the dock where a specific ship full of drugs is going to land? I mentioned before the costume choices made earlier. There was the leather jacket worn by Dick Lung's character, which is kind of echoed here by the one worn by Leslie Cheung. Costumes for the movie done by Bruce Yu. Again, somebody who had a very long career in Hong Kong cinema. I worked with him he did the Gen X Cops, Gen Y Cops films, which in a way were kind of youthful reinterpretations of the Hong Kong gangster genre. And he also recently worked on the Jackie Chan movie New Police Story, which was kind of like Gen Z. It was like a third movie in the Gen X, Gen Y series, and starred Nicholas Tsai, co-starred Nicholas Tsai, who I mentioned earlier, the son of Tsai Yin, who's one of our leading lights as an actor, somebody working in the industry at the moment, a young guy who does have some real weight as an actor and does have a lot of potential as one of this new generation of stars. So, as I mentioned, Leslie Cheung was extraordinary because, I mean, he was never openly gay. I think it's very hard to come out in Hong Kong society anyway, and certainly in Hong Kong show business you couldn't come out, but it was an open secret. And his audience embraced him regardless of his sexuality. And he was able to play roles, all manner of roles, heterosexual roles, and nobody batted an eyelid, even though it was widely known that, his lifestyle was widely known. It never really affected the audience's love and affection for him. And in that way, I think he was a very strong symbol in Hong Kong of how, the audience can be. If the audience loves an artist enough, they will be tolerant of their lifestyle. And so in that respect, he was kind of a trendsetter. He was somebody who paved the way towards, I guess, a slightly more compassionate society than perhaps had existed previously in Hong Kong. And his suicide was a huge shock. I mean, he jumped to his death from the Mandarin Hotel in Central for specific reasons that remain unclear, other than he was afflicted by depression. And I guess if the instrument by which you view the world, which is the mind, is itself afflicted, then it's very hard for somebody to kind of pull themselves back from the brink repeatedly. But it was a huge shock, and I remember going down to the hotel 2 days after he'd jumped, and his fans were there with wreaths of flowers, and there was a real genuine outpouring of grief and affection for him, and it was really very touching. So it's a great loss. But the only thing I'm glad about is that now we are reissuing the films, the better films of his career, the movies that really established him as a leading man, so that audiences worldwide can appreciate this huge talent that we've sadly lost. And actually, this sequence here, when you see the slightly lighter relationship between him and Emily Chew, it's much more like the real Leslie Cheung than the driven cop. I mean, he was a much more playful, light-hearted person, and so this is kind of a little window into the real Leslie Cheung. Incidentally, to this day, the taxi drivers say that they see his ghost on the corner of the Mandarin Hotel, kind of standing looking lost and forlorn. And it's been like, several cab drivers reported late at night they were driving by and they saw the ghost of Leslie on the corner of the Mandarin. Maybe that's why the Mandarin's being refurbished now. But anyway, that was kind of an urban legend that has sprung up since the passing of Leslie Cheung. This sequence here, I mean, again, Emily Chew, her character not really fully defined, but more an instrument to try to bring these two brothers together. And this is like really kind of the crux of her character's kind of really bringing these two together with love. And then at the end, it actually takes Mark Gore, the Chow Yun-fat character, to bring them together in blood, and it's kind of the same intention, but these very different methods. This, what we're seeing here leads up to what was my favorite line. I mean, often when films are originally subtitled, the subtitles are sometimes very direct translations of the Chinese, and though many times as people laugh about there's kind of misuse of English and these funny cracked subtitles, and it was a period when everybody was reading them out on the radio and saying how funny they were. Occasionally there was like a poetry to a translation that was actually maybe not exactly correct, but had a certain poetry to it. And I miss that sometimes when I see the more cleaned up, clear subtitling. I miss the earlier one. And this is actually one of my favorite lines coming up, was when this big confrontation happens between the two men about the fact that, the hopes of promotion that Leslie Cheung's characters had been crushed, and the father's been killed, and there's so much weight of guilt on the shoulders of Dick Lung. And it's kind of this big, tense confrontation. And then the payoff is a much quieter line from Leslie Cheung when he finally just says he kind of shows his resignation in terms of the fact this relationship cannot be saved. And he just says very simply, I'm a cop, he's a thief. We're walking different roads. And I thought after this particular outburst, that was really such a touching line. And in my own family, I had the same situation. I remember seeing the movie and really feeling that. I think it's the essence of great art, when it resonates with your own life. But this moment here, and I thought particularly after that rather overblown scene, this line here, I'm a cop, he's a thief, we're walking different roads. And it's subtitled differently, I'm sure, on this print, as it has been in the years since the initial release of the movie. But I always thought that was a really good line, and it really got to the crux of what the relationship was. Here we are down at in Aberdeen, down at the boat yards, and this is like Hong Kong, of course. It's a raison d'etre for many years, was as a shipping port, so we still do have major shipping areas, pleasure cruisers, trading ships coming in and out of the port, and they always make great locations for sequences in films. I remember when we shot Gen X Cops, we filmed not far from here, at more where they were putting these kind of pleasure yachts together. But this really makes for the handheld camera work here, really adding to the intensity of the sequence. And it's really John Woo coming into his own as a filmmaker and bringing to his bring not only his own experience of filmmaking in Hong Kong, but all he'd seen of the American new wave of films, what he'd seen of the European new wave, and redefining it in a whole new brand, a whole new style of filmmaking. And of course now, the idea that Hong Kong cinema would influence the rest of the world is kind of accepted. But at the time, the idea that this tiny British colony would be coming out with films that would completely redefine action filmmaking on a worldwide level was incredible. I mean, the people... And I was lucky to be on the cutting edge. And I'd seen this movie, the first time I saw this movie was actually when I was in Taiwan. And I'd seen the Kung Fu pictures done at Golden Harvest. And I'd seen these films and been saying to people, this is just amazing work. And of course, now, fortunately, over time, the films have got out in the West. Now we can do DVD reissues and bring out all the bells and whistles. And even a newer generation of filmgoers can go and see these movies and kind of see, as the old Chinese saying, when you drink the water, remember the place from which the water comes. So when you're watching Quentin Tarantino, when you're watching some of the films of Robert Rodriguez, when you're watching the Pang brothers, when you're watching the new generation of filmmakers, you can actually look back up River and see where they were influenced. And, you know, for this generation, a lot of the genre filmmakers are influenced by Asian cinema. Sequence of the blood coming out from Chow Yun-fat's nose in this sequence was actually censored in some prints. This actually is an actual rooftop overlooking the harbour on Hong Kong side, down towards Causeway Bay. The JL sign's not there anymore, but there you see the highway beneath. That's an actual shot, and they're actually up on top of the building. But this really brutal beating sequence, at the time there was still, in the Asian region, concern about having too much blood on screen. So this scene was actually quite heavily cut. I think the first print I saw in Taiwan, it had actually been, some of the blood spurting out from his nose had been cut. Look at the stuntmen, because you see the same guys in suits playing triad heavies as you used to see in the New Territories in the comedy kung fu movies playing kung fu fighters. The reason is you actually need the same skill set to beat somebody up or to be beaten up as a triad heavy as you do to be a supporting actor in a kung fu movie. So you would see the same guys. But that sequence there with the blood coming out of the nose, Chow told me it was quite tricky to shoot, that they had this kind of little time delay capsule up his nose that was going to spurt the blood out. And we've seen similar scenes in many films since, but this was, again, it was the original and trimmed from some territories because of the violence. Here's Chang Gong again. He would later still be working in Hong Kong films at the same time as he was making a name in international cinema. You could see him opposite Dick Lung in a latter kung fu picture, The Barefoot Kid, starring Aaron Kwok, which was directed by Johnny To, a rare foray into kung fu filmmaking for Johnny To, To Ge Fong. This sequence, I was always amazed the length of time it took for the other guys to come to the rescue of the boss, because they're certainly making a lot of noise, and you know, he's getting beaten by the thugs, and it's only after a while that the other workers actually leap into the fray, or the other ex-cons leap into action. You actually get to see Chang Gong only gets that little brief. He's such a kind of saintly figure. He's a guy who wants to turn the other cheek. He doesn't want to see Dick Lung's character go back to the dark side. But in the second film, in A Better Tomorrow 2, the sequel, he does actually come back into the fray, and you actually get to see Chang Gong in action. Of course, he had done action films. He'd done action scenes back in the old black and white Wong Fei-hung films. He's actually the bad guy in Barefoot Kid, and doesn't get to fight in that movie. But he, in his day, had been somebody, like all of these actors, had to do action scenes to whatever level in the films that he made. The action for this film, one of the action directors was Stephen Dong Wai, who would later work with Chow Yun-fat on Bulletproof Monk, which was an attempt to do like a kind of a fantastique action martial arts fantasy. Didn't really pay off, but he was one of the action directors on that movie. And previously, Stephen Dong had been himself a kung fu actor. He's the guy at the beginning of Enter the Dragon who's with Bruce Lee, and it went from that to being a stuntman, being an actor in movies like Incredible Kung Fu Master. Later, and Hocus Pocus, came out to become an action director, and later a director, directing movies like Hitman with Jet Li. And I remember, actually, I think I got in the job on Scooby-Doo. Somebody called me, said they're looking for a Hong Kong action director for Scooby-Doo, shooting in Australia. And I knew he was available, so he got to do Scooby-Doo. Still very active, both in Hong Kong and in the West. And he's just finished shooting a big epic called Battle of Wits, starring Andy Lau. and he was the action director for some of the sequences in this movie. I have seen on the internet Cheung Sudong credited as one of the action directors for this movie, but he's not on the film print, and so I don't think he was involved. It was the martial arts action scenes were left in the hands of Dong Wai. And there's John Woo's character, and this is kind of like really a kind of an extreme measures being taken by the police. Also, I noticed a disparity between the injuries and the blood on the face of Zhang Gong between the shots. But I guess they cleaned him up a little bit before he jumped in the car and drove away. A little bit of cheating there with the editing and the timing. But it works. I mean, it works because the audience is kind of very much on the side of Dick Lung and kind of wanting him not to be further oppressed by the police. This is very reminiscent of a sequence in John Woo's later film, The Killer, which was a sequence in daytime with two characters looking out over the city and kind of coming to terms with... And this is like an image, an idea, which you could see in Seven Samurai from Kurosawa, that you saw in The Wild Bunch from Sam Peckinpah. The idea of men whose time has passed, whose values are now considered outdated, who've been replaced by a younger and inferior generation and are kind of fighting a last stand for the old ways, for their old culture and customs, for these better days of previous times, and coming to terms with that. And here we see it at night, and I think probably John Woo was re-examining those ideas again in The Killer, and so he shot a similar sequence with the wounded men, like a wounded man, and looking out over the Hong Kong landscape. You saw just then briefly a shot of the old airport at Kai Tak, since the airport's moved out to Chet Lap Kok. But used to be, the airport was probably the most urban airport of any city in the world. So you had wonderful opportunities to shoot airport sequences and to shoot planes taking off and landing. So it was very useful. Now it's a little tricky. You have to go out to the airport and get permission to shoot on location. But this, John Woo, I think, all filmmakers find their métier and their environment, an environment that works for them. John Woo, certainly it was Hong Kong, and I don't think anybody who shoots Hong Kong as he has, or finds, ways to explore Hong Kong life and Hong Kong characters with quite the poignance that he does, because he's somebody who was brought up pretty much in a slum. His kind of like clothes and food provided by Christian missionaries. He was raised in the Christian faith, and I think his faith informs a lot of the ideas that you see in his movies. But he came up, and really his escape from that harsh environment was to go to see films, and later his escape as from living an ordinary humdrum existence was to become a filmmaker himself. But all of this, I think, all of his work reflects his environment and reflects his experience of Hong Kong. And I think one reason, perhaps, that his films have not worked as well in America, I don't think anybody would argue that the John Woo American films are as good or better than the films that he did in Hong Kong, is because he's out of his he's off his native soil. And here we see again, for the third time, this very distinctive red. It's like the doorway to hell, isn't it? It's like the gate to hell, this big red gate. And then we see Chow Yun-fat kind of coming back for his one shot at redemption in this particular scene. As I mentioned earlier, the action sequences by Dong Wai, and you see a lot of familiar faces among the stuntmen, guys who actually had done kung fu movies with Dong Wai prior to working on these kind of films. But talking before about the tradition, the films that John Woo had done prior to this, he'd done Princess Jyutping, which was it's a very famous opera, and I think the operatic style is very evident in this movie, in the action sequences, that there's a larger-than-life, grandiose style to the action. Then you look at From Riches to Rags, Plain Jane to the Rescue, you do get the occasional moments of very black humour in this movie. And then probably the movie that is a real transition film is Last Hurrah for Chivalry, which was in terms of box office, a disappointing Golden Harvest movie that he shot. But if you look at the film today in the light of it was kind of his attempt to do a Jeongjit film at Golden Harvest as a swordplay movie. But that didn't work because we'd already had Jeongjit. We already had Chang Cheh working at Shaw Brothers doing many swordplay movies, so it would not have, no way you could have the same impact. So then after that, after the failure of Last Hurrah for Chivalry, you have John Woo come in and say, okay, now I'm going to find a way to make the aesthetic of gunplay as visually appealing as the aesthetic of swordplay and martial arts, and then you get A Better Tomorrow. But I always thought that that title, Last Hurrah for Chivalry, could just as easily have been the English title for this film, because really, 英雄本色, True Colors of a Hero, there's no relation from that to A Better Tomorrow. A Better Tomorrow, the title, is actually an ironic kind of counterpoint to what the film is about, and is the title of a children's song that we hear in a scene that's coming up. But I think, had he not already used Last Hurrah for Chivalry, that might have been a cool title for this movie. But it's great, the use of smoke. A lot of the times in Hong Kong pictures, they'll actually have somebody burning incense, burning smoke to diffuse the light, and it's not a visual effect at this time. It's somebody physically would burn it. It would make it particularly tough for the actors to breathe, because you would have, especially if you were filming in a closed environment, you would have somebody kind of before each shot burning this smoke in the air to kind of like, and you'd say "Dodi yin," more smoke, because you wanted to have that diffuse look, unique diffuse look to the action, and that became like a trademark. Logan, by the way, can really ride a motorbike, and there are all these shots of him as a young fellow zipping around the back lot of the Shaw Brothers studios, taking girls for rides on the back of his motorbike. So obviously he has a stunt rider for some scenes, but in this, when you see him coming down on a motorbike, he actually could ride. This is an interesting juxtaposition Bruce Yu has here in the costumes. You see the very traditional, almost like the Wong Fei-hung style of clothing of the old boss who's in semi-retirement, and the real city slick Western style of Whitey Lee's clothing, because he's the up-and-comer. He's the guy who's usurping the leadership of the Triad. Interesting, the idea of reinventing Triad films in the image of swordplay heroes, because actually the Triads take as their forebears the survivors of the Shaolin Temple, the burning of the Shaolin Temple, who were oppressed by the Manchu usurpers of the government of China, and the idea that you kind of bring back the Ming dynasty to overthrow the usurping Qing dynasty. That was actually the root of the Shaolin fighters and the kung fu heroes that you saw in the old Shaw Brothers movies. But that's the same ancestors, the same five ancestors, the same five forebears to whom the Triad members actually claim allegiance. So there is, in terms of like folklore, there is kind of a lineal connection between the motivations for the characters you were seeing in the Zheng Jit movies and the motivations of the characters you're seeing here in A Better Tomorrow, this movie that really utterly redefined the genre. It was spitting out the cigarette there reminded me of an early character played by John Woo. I think it's in Dead End, when he actually, his younger version smokes two cigarettes at the same time, and somebody asks him why, and he goes, "Double the pleasure." And I always thought that was kind of I'm not advocating smoking, it is bad for your health, but I thought it was one of the things, Hong Kong, one thing Hong Kong cinema did, unfortunately, is it made smoking cool. And it made it cool again, because I think even in the 80s there was a whole thing of like, you shouldn't smoke. But when you looked at Chow Yun-fat, when you looked at some of these guys smoking, they looked so good doing it. It was a flashback to the glory days of Humphrey Bogart, and it kind of, people were perhaps influenced to smoke who otherwise would not. So that was kind of not such a great influence, but we have to acknowledge that smoke on the screen and smoking of characters has never looked more cool than it does in a Hong Kong movie. An interesting thing you see here, which might sound like an obvious thing for somebody who's grown up watching American movies, overlapping dialogue in this sequence. It was very unusual to have overlapping dialogue. The reason being that at the time this film was made, all the films were shot wild, without sound. And so later you would have dubbing artists come in. Often it was not the same guy who you saw in the movie. I mean, it was years before anybody knew what Jackie Chan sounded like, because it was perceived that Jackie did not have a great voice, so he'd have the same guy would dub him from film to film to film, and the audience accepted that. So for this movie, it was shot without sound, which meant that you could shoot the dialogue sequences very quickly. But it was relatively unusual to do overlapping dialogue, because that would be harder to recreate in the studio. But that last scene we saw actually had overlapping dialogue, and again a breakthrough for John Woo. Here we have the Wong Tai Sin Children's Choir, who brought in to sing this song, which is called A Better Tomorrow, which is obviously the title of the movie, the Cantonese title, Ming Tin Wui Gung Ho, and it's sung in Mandarin because it's a Mandarin song, and it's like the general meaning is tomorrow will be better, or better tomorrow. The song itself was written by Luo Da Yao. And so you have these, this is kind of a very John Woo juxtaposition, the fact that you're in a world of a dark world where people are going to live and die, where people are going to be, debts are going to be paid in blood, and he juxtaposes it with the innocence of these children singing. And it's kind of like later in The Killer, he told me that he juxtaposed the Virgin Mary as this image of innocence and purity and goodness deliberately against the blood and against this kind of the redemptive quality of bleeding for some ideal, for something you believe in. And it was all the more powerful that you had an image as strong as the Virgin Mary being blown up in the finale of The Killer. So here, just before we go into our final dark, bloody act of this film, we get the counterpoint of these children singing this sweet, innocent song about a better tomorrow. And there's a great shot of Dick Lung walking off into the shadows. Again, beautiful shot of Hong Kong. This is like, as I say, no one shoots Hong Kong better than John Woo. And I think what happened is he saw a lot of these European films and then came out and was walking around Hong Kong and looking at Hong Kong through the eyes of somebody who was thinking, how would I reinvent Hong Kong to look like the Paris of these European thrillers? And he does, an amazing job with it. Should mention one of the other action directors of the film. There are two credited action directors. I talked about Dong Wai, Stephen Dong. The other one is Blackie Ko Saoliang, who is a Taiwanese stuntman, actor, director, one of those guys with incredible multitasking that you see in Asian cinema. And he's billed here, or he's billed on the original Hong Kong print of the movie as Cylon Or, like the Cylons in Battlestar Galactica. And his Chinese name is Or Saulo. So he was like Cylon Or, but he's known more popularly as Blackie Ko, as Ko Xiaoliang. And he was a great stunt driver, famous for riding a motorbike, doing an Evel Knievel-style motorbike jump over the Three Gorges Dam, and was also a singer, bizarrely enough, singing in the original Taiwanese folk dialect. He did a lot of great stunts. When you see Jackie Chan crashing through all the glass at the end of Police Story on a motorbike, that's actually Blackie Ko. And he had a great acting role and did stunt work on Full Throttle with Andy Lau. Sadly, again, passed away a few years ago, a great loss to the industry. But he was the other action director on this movie, specializing in explosive stuff, car stunts, pyrotechnics. Stephen Dong was dealing with more of the hand-to-hand stuff. And, of course, trying to make real this whole new aesthetic that John Woo had come up with, the idea of how they were going to shoot gunplay, because it's one thing to conceive of that, the other is to actually go on the set with action directors and actually figure out how to make it happen. Here at a temple in Hong Kong, again, juxtaposition of the sacred and the profane, as you have guns and bombs and money and basically devilish dealings being done in a holy place. And this is a very if I can say typical, it's typical now because we've seen it a lot of times since, but at the time it was a groundbreaking idea that John Woo was exploring with his films. The long relationship John Woo had with Dick Lung prior to making this movie, because he had been, as I mentioned, the assistant director to Cheung Jit, to Chang Che at Shaw Brothers. So John Woo had actually worked with Dick Lung on a contemporary youth movie, a kind of rebel without a cause movie, Young People, and also on the period dramas The Water Margin and the epic Blood Brothers, Ti Ma, which I believe is going to be remade in the near future by the director Peter Chan. Chan Ho-sun is going to remake Ti Ma, going to remake Blood Brothers. So all that time, John Woo had actually got to work with Dick Lung as an AD, and the AD is somebody who will work a lot with the actors. So when it came time to do this movie, I think he had a very good impression of what Dick Lung's character was and what he should be in this film. And so it was an obvious choice when it came to cast that character, that he would go to Dick Lung. I think also he found every great action director has an alter ego on screen who's not him but the person he would like to be. And I think in the case of Kurosawa, it was obviously Toshiro Mifune. In the case of Melville, it was Alain Delon. And in the case of John Woo, it's Chow Yun-fat. Though I think actually in this particular film, different attributes of John Woo's persona are split equally between the characters played by Chow Yun-fat and Dick Lung. I mean, I think Chow Yun-fat has the look and the style at the beginning of the film that John Woo wishes he had, the kind of the European cool. And Dick Lung has the integrity and the decency and the desire to do good that's very intrinsic to and the love of family. That's a very, an intrinsic. We never really see any family on the part of Mark Gore, but we see Ken has family, and that's kind of like, that's something that really he has in common with John Woo's character. So there's a kind of a dual personalities here expressing aspects of John Woo. Here we are in the dockland. I mentioned before, Hong Kong, obviously a major port, so you have at night all this dockland that's available. This sequence here was borrowed for a movie starring a friend of mine, Maggie Q. If you look at Naked Weapon, there's a scene where she rides off in a speedboat and then comes back for a dockside showdown with the main bad guy. And I thought the way it was shot was very reminiscent to A Better Tomorrow. I think filmmakers around the world, consciously or unconsciously, kind of this became part of our zeitgeist. It was like, part of our shared communal experience, and you see images from this film reappearing. And in fact, one of the first times I saw like an obvious lift of the Mark Gore style was a movie called Nemesis, which is directed by the B-movie director Albert Pyun, and it starred Olivier Gruner, who was like a French martial arts champion who came to make movies in America. And he's in this kind of cyberpunk film, was wearing a long coat and glasses, and he had the whole style down. It's obvious that Albert Pyun, really ahead of the curve, had seen this film, had seen this character, and decided to kind of reinvent him in an American B-movie. So it was something that you became aware of increasingly as time passed, that images and ideas from both this movie and the subsequent John Woo films would have an influence on American action filmmaking. I mentioned the music for the film. I mean, it's really got one of the most imposing and impressive scores of this era. When the film was actually first brought out on DVD in America, the company that was doing like a 5.1 soundtrack found that they had problems in adapting the original music, and they thought, well, it's just a cheap Hong Kong gangster thriller, or so they thought. They would actually just replace it with library music, and nobody would know. And of course, when it came out, the fans were up in arms. And trust me, nobody, as I've experienced to my peril, nobody gets madder about the re-editing or mistreatment of an Asian film than Asian film fans. So they took this company over the coals, and in the end, they actually had to go back, redo the soundtrack with the original music. And also, after they had so many complaints, they actually, I think, when you actually brought back one of the DVDs with the fake soundtrack, they would replace it with one with the real music on. So it was like it was that much of a big deal. And quite right, too, because I think that the music of this film is really... It's a shame in a way, I guess, because it was a blend of original material and borrowed material. It hadn't become the trend at that time to do soundtrack albums in America, in the Hong Kong market. I think there was a soundtrack that maybe came out in Japan, where it was more common practice to release soundtrack albums or CDs. This, I think, is the moment, and Chow Yun-fat really... who's been a star, this is the moment when he becomes a superstar, is when he comes back and he's thundering away. Obviously, there's a driver of the motorboat who's crouching out of shot for this, but this scene when he comes back to the rescue, this coupled with the fact that you're seeing these extraordinary images of the explosions of stuntmen in flight, which, you'd seen extraordinary movement all the way through the history of Hong Kong cinema, and looking at the kind of movements people would execute in the Shaw Brothers films and the kung fu comedies, but you had not really seen that applied to contemporary action. So just seeing the wire pulls, the trampoline lifts, and all the other tricks of the trade, and it kind of, there's multiple kind of like bullets, kind of, it's almost like in the old days when you used to watch somebody hit somebody with a rapid fire series of punches. Now it was a rapid fire series of bullets. It was this extraordinary overkill. So you saw this whole new adaptation of Asian action, Hong Kong action cinema to the gunplay genre, and it was just mind-blowing for people. Coupled with the fact that you had this extraordinary, charismatic character in Chow Yun-fat. But again, as I mentioned before, what I admire increasingly about it is the way that everything is subservient to the plot and to the characters, and that it's like, characters action, action as character. And we get to the end of the movie, and it would be easy to kind of step aside and say, okay, we're now going to have a shootout that exists purely to demonstrate the imagination of the director and the action director and the physicality of the stunt team. But instead, everything that happens in this sequence actually is towards what is the movie about. Really, it's about the resolution of the rift between the two brothers, not the brothers played by, not the kind of the blood brothers played by Dick Long and Chow Yun-fat, but the real brothers, played by Leslie Cheung and Dick Long. So it's really about Mark Gore's sacrifice is to bring them together. And visually, this wonderful, the slow motion and the music playing, I mean, it's just, very evocative. And it's that great counterbalance that's in the heart and soul of John Woo between the ability to depict violence and action and bloodshed, coupled with this extraordinary heart and purity and real emotion. And drama rather than melodrama, and pathos rather than bathos. And I mean, I think he's got an unerring, at least in the films he made in Hong Kong, he had unerring instincts towards what would work. I mean, I still think one of the finest juxtapositions of music and visuals is in Bullet in the Head, when he scored the assassination in the bathroom to the Monkees song "I'm a Believer," which is something where, as a concept, you can't imagine it working, but when you actually see the film, you can't imagine it being done any other way than how he does it. And this is the genius of John Woo, to balance these two aspects. This is like kind of Chow Yun-fat, you can see where Chow Yun-fat gets the reputation of man of 1,000 bullets in the finale. The other thing that they always had with these films is the question that they kind of got away from the whole idea that guns had to be reloaded. So you had extraordinary numbers of bullets being pumped out from guns. Later, when John Woo made Hard Target, he actually made, I guess people in America were challenging that. So he actually created like an aesthetic way in which, an acrobatic way in which guns could be reloaded on the run, and made that part of his style. But at this stage, if you look at the films, if you analyze them, though the gunplay itself is really innovative, there's actually no way guns can actually fire that number of bullets without reloading, and probably that's a good thing too. So this is really the dramatic resolution of the film. It's not about killing the bad guy, and it's not about Chow Yun-fat becoming the leader of the gang again. It's actually about Kit recognizing the central goodness of his brother, and that's what the movie's pushing towards, and they never step away from that. And this is the sacrifice of Chow Yun-fat in this scene, and the way that John Woo uses blood. For one thing, it's got a different texture to it, because if you look at the days of Shaw Brothers Joan Jit's movies, if they got to the moment like this when the hero was being pierced by metal, which was always the finale of a Joan Jit movie, there'd be this kind of very reddish Shaw Brothers blood being sprayed everywhere, which kind of gave it a whole new aesthetic. So it was like you were a little bit distanced from the reality of it, because the blood was this extraordinary color. Here it approximates real blood. So it's like moving from an enhanced reality of the period swordplay films into a more specific reality of a contemporary crime thriller. And even the color of the blood and the way blood is used on the screen is one of the colors from the palette. One of the things he's using to paint the story with. The manner of doing it is different. But this, look at the lighting, the backlighting there. Again, something that we've seen a lot since then. But this idea of blue light as a backdrop against which you have these guns. I mean, there's no logic to it. I mean, I don't think any dock in the world that has lighting constructed in that way. But it's still a slightly heightened reality where you suspend your disbelief and you're in the moment and in the scene, and you really don't call to question any of the choices made in terms of lighting and editing. I like the fact that this is kind of like the decision that you have to make here is like, and again, it's a comment really on Hong Kong society, because the comment that Wai Lee makes in a moment about, I have money, therefore I can walk free, therefore I can commit almost any crime and get away with it. Actually, if you look at the history of the Hong Kong judicial system and the way that cases have come and gone, you could make a case for that. That in Hong Kong, money is so much the driving force behind people's lives that you can actually do whatever. As long as you have enough money, you can literally get away with murder. And I think this is John Woo kind of making a comment on that in this sequence when he says, who cares about brotherhood? Who cares about loyalty? I have money, therefore I'm above the law, and you may be the better man, but because you're just a cab driver and a failed gangster, then you're finished. And so, again, this is John Woo really expressing, in many interviews, he said how he feels that, the yesteryear, the days of chivalry and the days of brotherhood were better times, and that he wants to find a way through film to communicate to the younger audience of the day that there's a different way, that there are different values that, they can embrace, and there would be literally a better tomorrow if they did so. So this is like, again, a resolution. Again, not a misstep. The actual defeat of the bad guy, the actual killing of Lei Chi-hung's character, is the resolution of the relationship between these two brothers. So it's like, again, really pulling everything from story, everything from character. And this, I think, is the huge strength, the great strength of John Woo. And he's about to start work on his great period epic, Battle of Red Cliff. So I'm hoping, as he's shooting on China back on his native soil, that we'll see a true return to form for this genuine master of 20th century filmmaking, 21st century filmmaking now, and see him back to form. The song that we hear in the background as we play out over the end is actually performed by Leslie Cheung himself, by Jung Kok-wing, and it's called, in Cantonese, Don Nen Ching, or Dang Nian Jing, and it can be translated as previous love, but more like friendship from the old days. So it's very appropriate to the feelings of this scene when Mark Gore has died, and going into this kind of restored relationship between these two brothers. So a song performed by Leslie Cheung, who also performed a very affecting title song for Chinese Ghost Story. But one thing I did notice when I was watching the movie for the umpteenth time is actually this shot here is actually doubles. It's not the actual actors. And you look at the height relation between the two. I guess, they felt they needed to have a pickup shot, so that was it. A real pleasure to watch this masterpiece with you. I'm Bay Logan saying, Joy Gin.